It's been over 2.5 years since Putin started the Ukraine war, and he seems to be no closer to winning it. And with each day that passes, Putin's ambitions weaken not only his political position, but the foundations of the country he wants to return to glory. Putin broke his own country. The countdown to Russia's collapse is on, and time is running out for Putin. But how could this be possible? Despite all of his failures in Ukraine, Russia is still one of the largest political powers on the world stage, right? That may be the case for now, but Putin's terrible leadership, both in the war and outside of it, has set the stage for an imminent collapse, from which Russia may never truly recover. And it all starts with Russia's economy. On the surface, Russia seems to be making out pretty well from the Ukraine war. In April 2024, the BBC reported on International Monetary Fund or IMF figures that suggest that Russia was on course to grow far faster than many of its European contemporaries in 2024. The IMF claimed oil exports had held steady and that government spending was high enough to contribute to economic growth of 3.2% by the end of the year. Even 2025 would look good for Russia, claimed the IMF, as it suggested that the 1.8% growth it initially anticipated for the year would likely grow higher. In contrast, the organization believes the UK will achieve just 0.5% growth by the end of 2024, showing that Russia appears to be outpacing its European rivals economically. However, these figures don't tell the true tale of the economic tumult occurring in Russia right now. What the IMF fails to account for is that Putin has transformed Russia's economy into one that's almost solely reliant on the war. Writing for Project Syndicate, Swedish economist and former Atlantic Council senior fellow Anders Asplund says that Russia faces hurdles technologically, financially, and even demographically that are not well understood. Honing in on the financial side, he says that the sanctions placed against Russia by many Western nations have shaved between 2 and 3% off the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. That's a problem for Putin, Asplund claims, as it condemns Russia to economic stagnation and may impact its ability to fund the war against Ukraine. He adds to this, stating that Russia's GDP has dropped from $2.3 trillion in 2013 to $1.9 trillion today, with the collapse starting when Putin annexed Crimea. It gets worse. Asplund claims there's hidden inflation within the Russian Federation, meaning prices are rising at an annual rate of 9.1%, at a time when interest rates have soared to 19%. Then there's Russia's national reserve to consider. It only has $55 billion left from a peak of $183 billion in 2021. The Ukraine war has drained that reserve, with Asplund noting that Russia will likely spend 10% of its entire GDP on the war effort in 2024. These are not signs of a healthy economy. The situation is so bad that The Hill prophesizes an economic meltdown in Russia as soon as 2025. Immiserization and social discontent will grow in Russia as its economy tanks, claims the outlet, especially when Putin runs out of the resources he needs to keep his war machine running. War costs money, and despite what seems like positive economic growth figures for Russia, it's draining its national reserve, operating under the weight of massive sanctions, and is simply running out of the cash it needs to keep going. So what does this have to do with the Russian collapse? Regardless of whether the war carries on through 2025 or ends sometime soon, Russia's coffers are so drained that there's almost nothing left to take care of the country's public. Russia's people are dealing with a cost of living crisis at a time when they're unable to borrow money because of rampant rising interest rates, and it's clear that the Ukraine war has drained Russia so much that it's on the verge of collapse. We're already seeing signs of this within the country's infrastructure. In February 2024, NBC News published an article highlighting just how bad things are getting at home for the everyday Russian. It recounted the story of a 51-year-old woman named Elena Grezkaya-Silko, who spent much of the previous winter nearly shivering to death in her one-bedroom apartment. Living in Novosibirsk, a city in Siberia, she saw temperatures dip as low as -4 degrees Fahrenheit in January, yet she couldn't heat her tiny home properly. Multiple accidents, one on January 11th and another on January 17th, left her heating batteries stone cold. Hot water pipes were bursting, defects in the main heating systems kept warmth from flooding in. These are all infrastructural problems that have nothing to do with Ukraine and everything to do with the lack of investment in vital infrastructure. What is that? Where would the money for that investment even come from? Putin is spending it all on his special military operation. Grezkaya-Silko's story is far from unique. It's merely a microcosm of the infrastructural nightmare that is Russia in 2024. The situation highlights that Russia still runs on Soviet-era infrastructure, much like how its war machine heavily relies on Soviet weaponry, and the country is in dire need of upgrades that aren't coming. A considerable part of these networks were built during the Soviet era, the 1970s and 1980s, says a Russian economist named Igor Lipsitz. He goes on to say that the infrastructure is really worn out and needs replacing. But it's money, it's investment, it's work, so nobody's doing it, says The Economist. Putin is paying lip service to fixing the problems. In October 2024, the Jamestown Foundation reported on a visit to the Siberian Federal District by a Russian presidential envoy named Anatoly Seryshev. During a speech, Seryshev claimed that Putin saw the infrastructural problem as being enough of an issue for him to personally oversee efforts to improve it, but nothing seems to be happening. The Jamestown Foundation says the 2023-24 winter saw Russia hit with 577 major incidents affecting critical infrastructure across 59 of its regions. It wasn't just remote areas like Siberia being affected. Moscow experienced 31 of these incidents, showing that even Russia's richest city is running on creaking infrastructure. Expand the recordings of these incidents to the annual level, and there are 7,000 causing issues with Russia's heating infrastructure per year. Almost all are due to the attrition of infrastructure, according to the Jamestown Foundation. And most worryingly for Putin, such incidents have led to a wave of public discontent in the Urals and Siberia. Russia is also struggling under a potential rail collapse in the wake of Ukraine's invasion of the Kursk Oblast. Putin dedicated a large portion of the Moscow railway fleet to shipping soldiers into Kursk. Many of those trains ended up abandoned. Sanctions have also limited Russia's ability to get the spare parts it needs to keep its aging rail infrastructure moving. It's the heating situation all over again. What Russia has is too old to last for much longer. So what's the situation so far? Russia has plowed enormous amounts of cash into the war, leaving little to handle the country's widespread infrastructural problems. As the Jamestown Foundation points out, that lack of investment is nothing new. It's simply being highlighted at a time when Russia is blowing billions on a war that's actively damaging the country. Discontent is growing among the Russian population, and Putin's propaganda can't distract from the fact that many Russians are freezing in their own homes. Speaking of Russia's people, they offer another sign that Russia is on the verge of collapse. But it's not just their unhappiness with their leader that's the issue. Russia is dealing with a version of itself that simply doesn't have enough people to keep itself running. The Hill offered hints of this in its analysis of Russia's faltering economy. It points out that waves of Russian citizens left the country within months of Putin starting his special military operation. Around 1 million Russian professionals fled overseas, likely to avoid the prospect of being drafted into Russia's military. As for those who stayed behind and ended up being in that military, either due to mobilization or the lure of military contracts, over 720,000 of them are either dead or injured as a result of the fight against Ukraine. That's 1.7 million Russians, primarily men, who are either not here anymore or may be too injured to contribute to Russian society. Putin caused that problem over the course of the last nearly 3 years. And Russia's people problem gets even worse. It faces a massive demographic issue that is changing the very face of Russia. The Atlantic Council reports that the non-Russian share of the country's population was around 30% in 2023. That may not seem like such a huge amount until you realize that the non-Russian segment is growing at a far faster rate than the Russian segment. Around 70% of Russians live in the country's urban centers, where they simply don't have as many children as the citizens who live in the country's villages and small towns. Many of Russia's minority ethnic groups have birth rates that far exceed the Russian average, claims the Atlantic Council. With proof coming from official figures, the high number of deaths Russia has experienced in the Ukraine war may lead to a baby boom among native Russians in response. But that's far from guaranteed, especially as Russia struggles under wartime policies that undermine the very concept of population growth. Mobilization has killed hundreds of thousands of Russians. There's widespread reluctance to have children in the country, and who could blame prospective parents for that? Not only would those parents be bringing children into an increasingly dangerous Russia, but they'd also face the risk of the family unit being demolished if Putin enacts another round of mobilization. If you need proof of Russians not wanting to raise families in their own country, Russia's birth rate was the lowest it's been in 25 years during the first half of 2024. Even the Kremlin is panicking about these numbers. Putin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov says, "This is catastrophic for the future of the nation. The birth rate is now at a terribly low level, 1.4 births per woman." We're seeing echoes of the post-collapse Soviet Union here, according to the Fortune magazine. Terrible economic conditions and plummeting fertility rates were hallmarks of a Russia that was trying to recover from decades of Soviet leadership. Now we're seeing the same thing all over again under Putin, suggesting that Russians already know what's coming. Their country as they know it is broken. Putin's policies aren't doing much to help. Even if we discount the war, he's taken several actions that will prevent Russia's population from growing. For instance, October 2024 saw the Russian government cut its quota for residence permits granted to foreigners to around half of what they were before, 5,500 down from 10,600 in 2023. It's a small move which may tally with the logic that Putin wants to fix Russia's rising demographics problem, but it's also a move that comes at a time when Russia is dealing with a labor shortage. The country doesn't have enough people. Putin is actively preventing people from moving to Russia. This is a cycle that Russia can't sustain. War is killing hundreds of thousands at a time when people are choosing not to raise families. Never mind running out of labor to keep his country running, Putin may soon run out of soldiers to maintain his special military operation. That may already be happening. Plenty has already been said about Putin's increasing desperation in the context of the war. The campaign has stretched on for so long that Russia is now forced to rely on Soviet-era tanks that are even older than its creaking infrastructure. Some, such as the T-55, which has become a common sight in Ukraine, date back over 65 years. And worse yet for Putin, he's even running out of that old equipment, if The Economist is to be believed. Of the 1,530 tanks which Russia's former defense minister Sergei Shoigu boasted Russia had delivered throughout 2023, 85% were Soviet-era tanks. These stockpiles are running low, leaving Putin ever more desperate. To keep his war machine running, he has to invest even more of Russia's money into building tanks and other weapons, which only feeds into the infrastructural and quality of life issues we've highlighted so far. Add these equipment shortages to the manpower issue and you have an increasingly anxious Russia, so anxious that it's placed itself firmly in North Korea's pocket. Facing almost complete rejection from the Western community due to his actions in Ukraine, Putin was forced to forge an allegiance with North Korea, a country that knows all too well what isolation feels like. That alone should give you pause for thought. North Korea is ruled by a tyrant who oversees a country in which 42% of the population is malnourished, with many millions living in abject poverty. That's hardly a healthy ally to have, especially when you consider how North Korean President Kim Jong-un's rhetoric has made him a clear target for the West. Yet it's the country with which Putin signed a cooperative defense pact in June 2024 that says each will come to the other's aid if one of the countries is attacked on its own territory. Russia has taken quick advantage of this pact. When Ukraine invaded the Kursk Oblast, Putin called upon his new North Korean ally to provide troops and equipment to fend off the attack. Between 11,000 and 12,000 North Korean soldiers made their way into Russia in October and November, with most likely taking part in the 50,000-strong ongoing counteroffensive in Kursk as we speak. So what, you might think? This just looks like Russia strengthening itself by forging an alliance. But is Russia really getting stronger here? The mere fact that it's relying on a geopolitical pariah like North Korea to provide soldiers for its ailing military is telling. Putin wants to avoid implementing a second round of mobilization in Russia. He knows that doing so would only create an ever stronger tide of anti-Putin sentiment in a country that's already struggling economically and infrastructurally. Worse yet, Russia's manpower issues may make relying on North Korea even further a necessity as the war moves into 2025. Russia has already lost over 700,000 people to the war. It's lost even more as a result of people fleeing the country because of Putin's actions. The 11,000 or so North Koreans arriving in Russia to fight may be the first of many thousands that act as a sure sign that Russia simply doesn't have the people to keep Putin's war going. And that means that it won't have people to rebuild Russia once the war ends. Also, think about what this cooperative defense move means for Russia moving forward. The country is now beholden to Kim Jong-un, a crazy tyrant who repeatedly threatens much stronger Western nations. North Korea is getting something out of sending its soldiers into Russia. Alexander Gabuev of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin says that Russia is likely giving up its key military secrets to get its hands on the soldiers Putin so desperately needs. In addition to noting that North Korea's soldiers will get some much-needed combat experience in Ukraine, assuming they survive, Gabuev says, but that is secondary to the strategic capabilities they might obtain from Russia. Those capabilities may be new weapons and technology. They may also be the secrets behind building the nuclear weapons Kim needs to back up the many threats he makes against the West. Putin is no stranger to anti-Western rhetoric, but he's gotten into bed with a partner who may just be unstable enough to follow through on the types of threats that Putin only makes as a bluster. Russia is already struggling. Putting the country in debt to North Korea to get more soldiers will only accelerate the collapse that's starting to seem all but inevitable. Either Russia will do what North Korea wants in return for those soldiers, or, if it rebels, it could find itself facing off against a tyrant who's even more power-hungry than Putin. Russia is in a bad state. Economic turmoil and terrible infrastructure have led to an unhappy population. The country is dealing with a population crisis so severe that it's now relying on North Korea to help, and it's losing thousands more people to the Ukrainian meat grinder. And all of this is happening as Putin's ineffectual political systems are crumbling around him. Corruption is everywhere in the Kremlin. In June 2024, RAND discussed a series of reshuffles Putin undertook within his own government. The biggest was the removal of the previously mentioned Sergei Shoigu from his role as defense minister, with Shoigu being replaced by Andrei Belyusov. Russia claimed Putin made the move to increase innovation, according to RAND. But that statement is an attempt to hide the corruption Shoigu introduced, often with Putin's approval, into Russia's defense industry. Shoigu's removal was was accompanied by a series of arrests, as Putin attempts to crack down on issues that have slowed the progress Russia makes toward building new and better weapons. Do you remember that we mentioned Russia's increasing reliance on Soviet-era equipment in Ukraine? That may not have been a choice Russia wanted to make. Instead, there are hints that the political systems Putin built around himself, through which he promoted yes-men and allies ahead of competent officials, have resulted in Russia's newer weapons being such failures that it's forced to rely on the old equipment. Putin's removal of Shoigu and his resulting crackdown see him throwing a tantrum over a situation he created. Too many people profit personally from the corruption that runs through the Kremlin. Even Shoigu has managed to land a new, albeit not as powerful, position as Russia's Secretary of the Security Council. That means he'll still be able to keep some of his fingers in the military-industrial pie Putin has baked. Russia is committing 10% of its GDP to defense spending, and a huge portion of that ends up in the pockets of the people Putin appoints to run his government with him. That's an untenable situation set against the backdrop of a Russia dealing with massive inflation and interest rates. Of course, corruption in the Kremlin is nothing new. As The Conversation said in July 2023, Putin rules through a combination of fear and favor, cynically upending Russia's proto-democracy by making dissent a crime. In other words, Russia hasn't evolved into what it had the potential to become following the end of the Soviet Union. If anything, it's gone backward, ruled once again by an autocrat who makes overtures about tackling corruption when he himself is the root cause of the very blight that runs to Russia's core. Putin's ineffectual government can no longer live off the glory of being the one that tackled Russia's economic problems between 2000 and 2007. It plunged the country right back into the situation from whence it came, as Putin focuses more on regime security than actually improving the country. Putin's failings leave Russia destined to be little more than a nuclear-armed raw materials appendage of China, claims The Conversation. It may not even become that, now that Russia has stacked up with North Korea. It all adds up to a complete lack of cohesion within Russia that may cause an ideological collapse along with the economic, infrastructural, and manpower issues we've already discussed. Yuri Olinyk, who heads research at the Analytical Center of Ukrainian Studies of Strategic Research, certainly seems to think so. Speaking to the Ukraine Media Center, Olinyk says, "The Russian Federation has already begun its path towards collapse. Now we see a big difference between what it pretends to be, a big totalitarian state with overall control that can mass imprison all oppositionists, can destroy people, but in fact we can see the government is controlling neither the elite representatives and the persons close to the government nor its influence on entire regions." In other words, the Kremlin is losing its grip on the wider Russian Federation. Olinyk goes on to point out there are clashes between Chechen and Dagestani security forces, both territories that are supposed to fall under Russian rule. The leaders of other nations that fall within the Russian Empire are increasingly moving away from relying on Moscow for help. Tajikistan, which has long been a Russian ally, is now stressing it should rely on its own power rather than Russia's in the wake of drone attacks and natural disasters, the analyst claims. We see the center of the empire, which has always been the center of totalitarianism, as well as its single ideology, no longer works, Olinyk adds. The center of the Russian Empire losing its grip on the many states it controls or is allied to will only hasten Russia's collapse. The Atlantic Council mentioned this as one of 5 possible scenarios Russia might face in the future, back in February 2024, under an eye-catching heading claiming that Russia might face chaos, civil war, and colonial freedom. The organization points to several of the issues we've already highlighted in this video: a crumbling economy, the exploding number of deaths in a war that exists mostly to assuage Putin's ego and expand a supposed empire that's already at its limit, even the long-buried frustrations of the people, both inside Russia and in the non-central territories it controls, all may come to bear in the coming years, leading to a Russia that is a shadow of its former self. Even the Atlantic Council says that this scenario may appear fanciful, almost fantastical, but it reminds us that Russia also experienced 2 instances of massive social upheaval in the 20th century alone. The fall of the Tsars and the rise of the communist ideas that gave birth to the Soviet Union happened in the 1910s. Around 70 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed in on itself. And now, close to 35 years after the Soviet Union's collapse, we're seeing Russia make so many of the same mistakes again. Its damaged economy and increasing isolation from the rest of the world may do enough damage alone. Add crumbling infrastructure to that mix, and you have the potential for a populace that's become so dissatisfied that it rebels against Putin. Even if that rebellion doesn't happen, there'll be fewer Russians to sustain the country in the future. Hundreds of thousands are dying in the war, and people aren't having as many children as Russia needs to sustain itself. Political incompetence and purposeful corruption have also eroded the Kremlin to the point where the countries Russia should control under its empire are slipping out of its grasp. And finally, Russia is so desperate that it's turning to one of the most isolated nations in the world to prop up its army. and provide the manpower it desperately needs. Win or lose in Ukraine, Russia is far from a healthy country. It bears all the hallmarks of a broken nation that is on a countdown to implosion. But what do you think the future holds for Russia? Is it really a nation on the verge of crumbling into dust because of Putin's policies? Or will the Russian Federation manage to survive all of the issues it has, or even become stronger in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you as always for watching the video. Now go and check out Russia would be removed from the map if it does this, or click this other video instead.